The first sign I noticed when I got home was that my garage sounded wrong. And I know that sounds strange, but a room that has held 3 old V8 engines for years develops its own kind of silence. This silence was hollow, almost embarrassed, like the building knew something had happened while I was gone and did not know how to tell me. When I raised the door and saw nothing but bare concrete, I realized my new HOA president had stolen nearly $250,000 from me, and she had done it using a fake name, forged paperwork, and the confidence of a woman who had never once considered that the quiet neighbor in the faded work shirts might investigate fraud for a living. My name is Aaron Keller, and for 11 years I have worked financial crimes for the county sheriff's office in northern Georgia, mostly cases involving forged checks, fake contractors, insurance scams, and people who believe deleting an email is the same thing as erasing evidence. That job changes the way you look at people, because after enough time you stop listening only to what they say and start noticing patterns. The pauses before an answer, the little details they repeat too carefully, the documents that look official until you ask who actually signed them. But when I came home at night, I tried to leave all of that behind. My escape was a detached brick garage at the edge of my property, a place that smelled like gasoline, old leather, metal polish, and the coffee I was always forgetting on top of my toolbox. Inside sat a 1967 Shelby GT500 I had spent 14 years restoring, a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda in deep green, and a 1969 Corvette Stingray that had belonged to my uncle before he died. Together they were insured for about $240,000, but that number never meant much to me. The Shelby had been a rusted shell when I found it behind a feed store in Alabama. The Barracuda had taken me 6 years to rebuild, and the Corvette still had a small cigarette burn in the passenger seat from my Uncle Frank, who swore for 30 years that it had already been there when he bought the car. Those cars were not trophies. They were time machines. And that garage was the one place where nobody needed anything from Detective Keller. The unusual part was that the garage did not legally belong to the residential subdivision around it. The building sat on a separate parcel that had been zoned for light commercial use back when the area was mostly orchards and dirt roads, decades before anyone built Willow Creek Ridge or formed an HOA. I had checked every survey, deed, zoning map, and county record before buying the house, partly because I am cautious and partly because I have spent too much of my career watching people lose money after trusting a handshake. The arrangement was simple. My house belonged to the neighborhood. My garage did not. That distinction had never bothered anyone until Linda Carver moved into the blue Colonial across from me. Linda was 54, recently divorced, formerly employed as a regional property manager, and built like a person who considered waiting in line a personal attack. Within 3 months of moving in, she became president of the HOA, mostly because nobody else wanted the job, and she spoke at meetings with the confidence of someone announcing weather alerts. Her campaign promise, if you can call it that, was to restore consistency, which turned out to mean she wanted every mailbox black, every porch light warm white, every lawn exactly 2.5 inches high, and every human personality kept discreetly behind closed blinds. The first time she mentioned my garage, she caught me polishing the Corvette on a Saturday morning. She stood at the end of the driveway in white tennis shoes and a bright red visor, holding a clipboard against her chest. She looked past me at the cars and said, "Aaron, we need to discuss the vehicle storage problem." I leaned against the fender and asked, "What problem would that be?" She gave me a patient smile, the kind people use when they have already decided you are stupid. Inoperable vehicles are not permitted in Willow Creek Ridge. I told her they were operable, registered, insured, and stored inside a building that was not under HOA jurisdiction. Her smile tightened. "We all live in the same community," she said. "Technicalities do not change the visual impact." That sentence told me almost everything I needed to know about Linda Carver, because people who call legal boundaries technicalities are usually planning to cross them. A week later, the first notice appeared in my mailbox, printed on thick cream paper with the HOA logo at the top, warning me about abandoned vehicles and possible petroleum contamination. I sent back a polite response with copies of the zoning record and deed map. Linda answered with another notice, this one accusing me of operating an unauthorized repair business. I was not running a business. I never charged anyone a dime, but I saved the letter, scanned it, and placed it in a folder. Then came a third notice, a fourth, and eventually a seventh, each one more dramatic than the last. By the end, she was describing my garage as a public health threat, which was impressive considering she had never been inside it. I could have shut her down immediately with a lawyer's letter, but something in her behavior made me wait. Linda was not simply mistaken. She was building a story. I saw her creeping past the garage in her silver crossover, slowing down just enough to take pictures through the windshield. My security system caught her standing near the property line with a tape measure, then returning 2 nights later with a man I later learned was her brother-in-law, pointing toward my side door and whispering like they were planning a bank job. The cameras were new. 12 motion-activated units with cloud storage, night vision, and microphones sensitive enough to catch a conversation from the sidewalk. I had installed them after a burglary case reminded me how often victims discover their cameras stopped recording exactly when they were needed. Linda did not know about them. She believed the little black fixtures under the roofline were old floodlights, and I was happy to let her believe that. The whole thing might have stayed a ridiculous neighborhood feud if I had not mentioned to my next-door neighbor, Sam Holloway, that I was leaving for a 9-day federal evidence course in Maryland. Sam was harmless, but news traveled through Willow Creek Ridge faster than smoke through an air vent, and by that evening, Linda knew my departure date. I saw her from my kitchen window, standing in her dining room with her phone pressed to her ear, looking directly at my garage. The next morning, she appeared at my door with an oddly cheerful expression and asked whether I needed someone to collect my mail while I was away. I told her it was handled. She glanced over my shoulder toward the garage and said, "Well, enjoy your trip. I am sure everything here will be taken care of." The way she said taken care of stayed with me. Before leaving, I checked every lock, tested every camera, photographed each car, and uploaded copies of the registrations and insurance records to a secure drive. Maybe that sounds paranoid, but paranoia is just preparation that annoys people until something goes wrong. I pulled out before sunrise on Sunday, watching the garage shrink in my rearview mirror, and for a moment I considered turning around and confronting her directly. Instead, I kept driving. Somewhere beneath my irritation was the cold instinct that had served me well in hundreds of interviews. The sense that Linda had already made a decision and all I had to do was give her enough room to reveal it. What I did not know was that before I reached Maryland, she had already created a fake email account, printed fraudulent environmental forms, and called a towing company under the name Patricia Lane. By Monday morning, she was standing in my driveway wearing a navy blazer and holding a folder full of lies, while a flatbed truck backed toward the garage and my cameras quietly began recording the biggest mistake of her life. The flatbed arrived at 7:42 Monday morning, according to the timestamp on camera 3, driven by a man named Eddie Ruiz, who had the wary expression of someone already sensing that the paperwork in his hand did not match the scene in front of him. He stepped out, looked through the open side window of the garage, and then looked back at Linda. "Those do not look abandoned," he said. Linda did not hesitate. That was one of her talents. Hesitation gave other people room to think. And Linda preferred people obedient. "They have been stored illegally for years," she told him, tapping the folder against her palm. "The owner has ignored repeated environmental notices, and the association has authorized emergency removal." Eddie walked closer to the Shelby, careful not to touch it. He asked whether she had contacted the owner directly. Linda gave him the little wounded smile she used whenever somebody questioned her authority. "I'm Patricia Lane, the property compliance manager," she said. "I have been handling this case personally. The owner is unreachable, the vehicles are leaking fluids, and the board is concerned about groundwater contamination." None of that was true, but she delivered it with the flat, practiced tone of someone reading a weather report, and that is what made it effective. Most people expect liars to sweat, stumble, or look away, but professional confidence can carry a bad story surprisingly far, especially when it comes with a logo, a clipboard, and a threat of liability. Linda had prepared an indemnification form promising that the HOA would accept responsibility for the removal, and she had attached what appeared to be a county hazard notice. The county seal was real, but the document beneath it was not. She had copied the header from a public PDF, changed the address, added my garage, and signed the name of an environmental officer who had retired 4 years earlier. Watching that later, frame by frame, I almost admired the amount of effort she had invested in destroying herself. Eddie still seemed uncomfortable. He pointed to the license plates, the battery tenders, the clean tires, and the dust covers folded neatly on my workbench. "Patricia," he said, "abandoned cars usually do not have current registration stickers. Linda stepped closer and lowered her voice. Your dispatcher already accepted the work order. If you refuse an emergency environmental removal, I will need your full name for the report. That did it. Fear of being blamed is a powerful thing. And Eddie was not a lawyer or an investigator. He was a towing operator trying to get through a Monday. He called his office, spoke with his manager, then began loading the cars. First came the Corvette, my uncle's Corvette, the engine silent as the winch pulled it into the daylight. Linda stood near the driveway with her arms folded, watching like she had ordered a dead tree removed. Then came the Barracuda, its green paint flashing under the morning sun, followed by the Shelby, the car I had spent more than a decade rebuilding bolt by bolt. At one point, Eddie paused and asked whether the tool cabinets were part of the removal order. Linda looked through the paperwork, then told him anything associated with the unauthorized repair operation could be considered contaminated equipment. That was how she added 2 rolling cabinets, a compressor, and several crates of original parts to the haul. It was not enough to erase the cars. She wanted the whole garage stripped clean, because in her mind, the empty building would prove she had been right all along. The cameras caught her afterward, walking slowly across the bare concrete with a satisfied look on her face, then taking photographs from several angles. She even opened my side refrigerator, found nothing but bottled water and an old sandwich, and photographed that too. I suppose every environmental emergency needs lunch evidence. Back in Maryland, I knew none of this was happening. The course was held at a federal training complex where personal devices were locked away during most of the day, and we spent 10 hours at a time studying digital evidence preservation, financial tracing, and interview strategy. There was an irony in sitting through lectures about fabricated identities while Linda was using one to steal my cars. But irony is usually only funny after you survive it. I got my first chance to check messages Wednesday evening. There were 2 missed calls from Linda and 1 from an unknown number, but no voicemail. I logged into the security portal, only to discover that the connection was too slow to load full video. The thumbnail from the garage camera looked darker than usual, but I assumed the door was closed and promised myself I would check during the longer communication window on Saturday. What I did notice was that Linda had called my house twice after the removal, once Monday afternoon and again Tuesday morning. She did not leave a message either time. Later, when I reviewed the footage, I saw why. She was checking whether I had returned early. She rang the bell, waited, walked toward the driveway, then left with the relaxed posture of somebody confirming the body was still buried. On Thursday night, she hosted an informal gathering at her house for several board members. Camera 6 captured pieces of the conversation from across the street, mostly laughter, glasses clinking, and Linda describing how decisive leadership sometimes required unpleasant action. One board member named Melissa Grant asked whether the garage was legally part of the HOA. Linda said the matter had been reviewed by council, which was another lie, and added that the owner had been given every opportunity to cooperate. Melissa asked what company had removed the cars. Linda answered, Riverside Recovery Services, then quickly changed the subject. The board members were not innocent, exactly, but most of them were passive. And passive people often become decorations in someone else's bad decision. They wanted the street quiet. Linda promised them quiet, and nobody wanted to ask how she intended to achieve it. Saturday evening, I finally had an hour with my laptop. I pulled up the security dashboard, clicked the garage feed, and saw bare concrete. For maybe 3 seconds, my brain refused to interpret the image. I thought the camera had reset to an old view or the angle had changed. Then I saw the empty wall brackets, the loose extension cord, and the rectangular clean spots where the cabinets had stood. My chest tightened so hard I had trouble breathing. I opened the archive footage and watched Linda enter my driveway under the name Patricia Lane, watched her hand over fake documents, watched the Corvette disappear, then the Barracuda, then the Shelby. Anger came first, hot and immediate, the kind that makes your hands shake. But training has a strange way of taking over when emotion becomes useless. I stopped watching the story as a homeowner and started watching it as evidence. I wrote down the arrival time of the truck, zoomed in on the company logo, saved the audio of Linda identifying herself, captured the moment she signed the work order, and downloaded every camera angle available. Then I called the unknown number from Wednesday. A woman answered, identifying the business as Riverside Recovery Services. I told her my name and address, and the silence that followed told me she had found the job in their system. She said 3 abandoned vehicles and contaminated equipment had been removed under emergency authorization. I asked who gave the authorization. Patricia Lane, she said, compliance manager for Willow Creek Ridge. I asked where the vehicles were. She hesitated, then said they were being held at a secured yard pending environmental disposal. Disposal. That word went through me like cold water. I told her not to touch them, not to move them, not to remove a single part, and that the vehicles were registered, insured, privately owned, and worth more than $200,000. Her tone changed immediately. She transferred me to the owner, a man named Carl Mercer, who started defensive and ended terrified. Carl said they had documents, signatures, an HOA authorization, and a contamination report. I told him the person who signed those papers did not exist. The garage was outside HOA jurisdiction, and his company had entered private property to remove valuable vehicles based on fraudulent instructions. Then I gave him my badge number and told him to preserve everything. Every email, recording, document, dispatch note, and camera file. Carl stopped arguing. He promised the cars would remain untouched until I arrived. I barely slept for the rest of the trip. On Sunday afternoon, I drove home through heavy rain, rehearsing every possible outcome. Damaged paint, missing parts, engines exposed to weather, maybe even one of the cars already sold through a salvage channel. When I pulled into Willow Creek Ridge, Linda was trimming roses beside her driveway. She looked up, saw me, and froze for half a second before lifting one hand in a cheerful wave. "Welcome back," she called, as if she had not emptied my garage. I lowered the window. "Good trip," I said. Her eyes flicked toward the detached building. "Very productive week here, too," she replied. I smiled, because at that moment I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. Linda believed the fake name had protected her, and she had no idea I already possessed enough evidence to tear her entire story apart. I did not confront her. I parked, walked into the empty garage, and let the silence settle around me until the anger became useful. Then I went inside, opened my laptop, created a case folder, and named it Carver Fraud Timeline. By sunrise, I had organized the videos, audio, HOA notices, deed records, zoning maps, and every call connected to Riverside Recovery. At 8:30, I drove to their yard carrying a binder thick enough to make honest people nervous and dishonest people start sweating. Carl Mercer met me at the gate with Eddie Ruiz beside him, both men looking like they had spent the weekend waiting for a hurricane. The 3 cars sat in the back row under plastic covers, dusty but intact. I touched the roof of the Shelby and felt something in me loosen. Then Carl handed me Linda's paperwork, and there it was, the name Patricia Lane, written in blue ink, right below a forged county authorization and directly above Linda Carver's unmistakable handwriting. I looked at Carl, then at Eddie, and said, "Gentlemen, you were not hired to tow abandoned vehicles. You were manipulated into participating in grand theft, and the woman who did it is about to stand in front of the entire neighborhood and take credit for it." Carl's face went pale. Eddie muttered something under his breath, and for a moment the 3 of us stood there between rows of wrecked sedans and rusted pickups, staring at 3 classic cars that had nearly been destroyed because one woman wanted a cleaner view from her kitchen window. Carl asked what I planned to do, and I told him the truth. I was going to give Linda exactly what she wanted, an audience. The next HOA meeting was Thursday night, and Linda had already added environmental remediation success to the agenda. She believed she was about to take a victory lap, maybe earn another round of applause from people who thought leadership meant speaking louder than everyone else. I asked Carl and Eddie for signed statements, copies of every email, dispatch recording, invoice, forged form, and internal note attached to the job. Carl agreed before I finished the sentence. He also offered to return the cars immediately, but I told him to wait until Friday. I wanted Linda to enter that meeting believing the evidence of her crime was still sitting safely out of sight. For the next 3 days, I did what I had done in hundreds of fraud cases. I built the timeline so carefully that there was nowhere for a lie to hide. At 7:12 Monday morning, Linda tested my doorbell. At 7:28, she entered the commercial parcel without permission. At 7:34, she identified herself as Patricia Lane. At 7:39, she handed Eddie a forged county notice. At 7:42, the first vehicle was removed. Every action had a timestamp. Every statement had audio, and every page she signed could be compared with the 7 HOA notices she had mailed me over the previous 2 months. Her handwriting had the same sharp angle on capital letters, the same long tail on the final E, and the same impatient pressure marks where the pen nearly cut through the paper. She had tried to disguise it, but people rarely understand how much of themselves they leave behind in the smallest habits. On Wednesday afternoon, Linda knocked on my front door. I opened it just far enough to see her standing there with a sympathetic expression that did not reach her eyes. "I hope you were not too upset by the cleanup," she said. "Cleanup," I repeated. She folded her hands in front of her. "The board had to act. You were unavailable, and the environmental risk could not wait." I asked whether she had personally authorized the removal. Her chin lifted. "I was not directly involved in the operational details." That answer was so carefully phrased I almost smiled. "So who was?" I asked. "Our compliance department handled it." "We do not have a compliance department." "Linda." For half a second, the mask slipped. Then she recovered and gave me the same cold smile she had worn the first day she saw my garage. "Aaron, I understand that you are emotional, but the neighborhood cannot be held hostage by one person's hobby." I looked at her and said, "You should come to the meeting tomorrow. I think the board deserves a full explanation." She mistook that for surrender. Her shoulders relaxed, and she said she was glad I was finally willing to be reasonable. Thursday night, the community clubhouse was packed with about 30 residents. More than usual because Linda had spent the week telling people she had solved the garage problem. She sat at the front table in a cream blazer, a wooden gavel beside her, and a slideshow already loaded behind her. The first image was my empty garage. The second was one of the forged hazard forms. The third was a photograph of a tiny oil mark on the concrete, enlarged until it looked like an aerial view of a toxic spill. Linda spoke for nearly 10 minutes about courage, property values, and the burden of leadership. She said difficult decisions were never popular, but responsible people acted before disaster struck. A few people nodded. One man even clapped. I sat in the back row with a plain folder on my lap and waited until she asked for questions. Then I stood. Linda saw me and smiled like a teacher calling on a difficult student. I said, "I only have one question. Who is Patricia Lane?" The room changed before she answered. Her smile stayed in place, but everything behind it disappeared. "I have no idea," she said. I walked to the front and placed the towing authorization on the table. "That is strange, because Patricia Lane signed this document, claimed to manage compliance for Willow Creek Ridge, and ordered the removal of my vehicles." Linda looked down without touching it. Anyone could have written that name. I placed the still image beside the form. Linda, standing in my driveway with the pen in her hand. Then I added a copy of one of her HOA notices. "Same handwriting," I said. "Same pressure pattern. Same letter formation. Same signature rhythm." Her voice hardened. "You were trying to intimidate this board." "No," I said. "I am showing this board how it was used." I set my badge on the table, quietly, without drama, and the silence in the room became absolute. "My name is Detective Aaron Keller, County Financial Crimes Division. I have spent 11 years investigating forged documents, false identities, and theft by deception. While I was attending a federal evidence course, my security system recorded you creating a fake persona, presenting forged county forms, entering property outside HOA jurisdiction, and directing a towing company to remove assets insured for $240,000. Linda stared at the badge as if it had appeared by magic. Then she whispered, "This is ridiculous." I opened the folder and slid Carl's statement across the table, followed by Eddie's, the dispatch transcript, the fake email account records, the deed map, and the zoning documents. "You told the towing company those cars were abandoned. They were registered and insured. You told them the parcel belonged to the HOA. It does not. You claimed an environmental emergency. No inspection ever occurred. You forged a county officer's name, invented an employee, and signed an indemnification agreement using authority you did not possess." She stood so quickly her chair scraped across the floor. "I was protecting the community." That was when Melissa Grand, the board member who had questioned her earlier, spoke from the second row. "Did the board approve any of this?" Linda turned toward her. "We discussed the need for action." "No," Melissa said. "We discussed sending another letter. You never told us you were taking the cars." The room erupted. People started talking over one another, asking whether HOA funds had been used, whether the association could be sued, whether their names were on the paperwork. Linda grabbed the gavel and struck the table, shouting for order, but authority disappears quickly once people realize it was borrowed. I leaned toward her and lowered my voice. You thought the fake name would separate you from the crime, but every lie led directly back to you. The cameras caught your face, the microphone caught your voice, and the documents caught your hand. She looked at me with pure hatred and said, "You set me up." I shook my head. "No, Linda, I left town. You did everything else." Melissa called for an emergency vote to remove her as president. It passed 28-1, with Linda casting the only vote in her own favor. By the time I walked outside, 2 patrol cars were pulling into the lot. I had already turned the evidence over to investigators who were not personally connected to me, because I wanted no question about procedure. Linda came through the doors behind me. No blazer now, just a frightened woman clutching her purse while half the neighborhood watched from the sidewalk. She did not look like a tyrant anymore. She looked small, and for one brief second I almost felt sorry for her. Not because she was innocent, but because I could finally see how completely she had confused control with respect. The next morning, Carl returned every car, every tool cabinet, and every crate of parts. The Shelby had a small scratch near the rear wheel, which Riverside paid to repair, and Carl refused to charge me a dime. Linda listed her house for sale the following week. The criminal case moved forward on fraud, forgery, false reporting, and theft-related charges, though the final sentence was nowhere near the 20 years people in the neighborhood kept whispering about. Real justice is usually less cinematic than revenge. More paperwork, more hearings, more waiting, but it still matters. These days, I work in the garage with the doors open. The new HOA board knows exactly where its authority ends, and once a year Melissa asks me to review their compliance procedures, which is not how I expected this story to end. Still, I think about Linda sometimes, and I wonder whether I exposed a criminal or destroyed a lonely woman who had wrapped her whole identity around being needed. Maybe both things can be true. So tell me what you think. Did I handle it the right way? Or should I have confronted her before she crossed the line? Was the public meeting justice, humiliation, or a little of both? Share your verdict in the comments. Tell me the worst HOA power trip you have ever seen. And if you believe property rights still mean something, like the video, subscribe, and stick around, because the quietest neighbor on the street may be the one keeping the best records.